it was the beginning of a beautiful partnership, which led us on to another project that we worked on together called Traces, Olion, which was very much building on this project with New Eyes I See. So we had come together again, put in another funding application for a separate piece of work that continued to look at this sense of embodying journeys through heritage sites. And we continued to work with Amgueddfa Cymru, the museum, on this project. So they came on board as a partner to look at a different site that they look at called St Fagans, which is a place in Cardiff, which is the National
Museum of History.
Museum of History, yep. Thank you. National Museum of History, which is a great place. Everybody, I think, who lived in Cardiff, that would be their school trip.
Yeah.
It has basically lots of different areas. So you've got this amazing space where they've rebuilt houses or dwellings through history. If you haven't been, go. It's incredible. And then they have another space, which is these beautiful gardens and the, I guess, original manor house that existed there on the site before the museum, I guess, took ownership of it or custodianship of it. So we started, I guess, with a recce of the site. We weren't quite sure exactly what stories we were going to tell. We weren't quite sure where the stories or journeys would lead us. So we sort of had a little wander around the site, and the gardens were very much a place where we felt had lots of potential. And through a lot of research and discussion with the staff at St Fagans, we realised that at the time the gardens weren't getting as much footfall as the other side, which is the houses and dwellings through history. And this was sort of mainly due to the site going through a huge period of development. So their main entrance had shifted. So the journeys that people were making were possibly slightly different from what they would normally make. So there was more footfall heavily onto one side of the site than the other. So we decided to focus our project on this side of the site that had less footfall. And again, we went through the same sort of process, didn't we? We had a look through the archives. We spent lots of time at the site, just physically being in the space and sort of absorbing that environment and that atmosphere.
We did some kind of like user needs stuff as well, didn't we?
Yes.
So we went and stood in the church for a day. We chatted with people who were just, wandering around the site about, what kinds of experiences they would like to see, what they'd enjoyed doing. And yeah, it was quite clear from the discussions we were having with people there that, everyone comes in the site and then they turn left. But I think that's the thing anyway, like in supermarkets and IKEA and, all the rest of it, people walk in and then they turn left. I don't know why.
I think it's a design thing, isn't it? And they set the high value items and stuff in to the left and stuff, or they make you go through bits that they're going to have to come back through.
And we had, I think, a session with staff as well, where we talked with them about what they would like to see and what some of the kind of challenges, might be, what would be the kind of limiting factors in terms of trying to do something on site. And at which point we kind of established that there was, very little connectivity. And so to do something digitally, we would have to be quite creative in how we went about that.
Yeah, there was quite a lot of restrictions because I think originally we wanted to create something similar to with New Eyes OC with projection and sound, but maybe have more installations so that you'd have, rather than carrying something around with you, you would be triggering points of these hubs of content through projection and sound. That was the kind of idea, but we realised quite quickly that infrastructure wasn't necessarily available to us, and also kind of maintenance of all of the kit and the equipment, and also limited by budget as well. And often, I guess, those types of restrictions are really useful because I think the project that we created was a better version of what we originally had in mind, as with things are often the case. So we ended up creating an app which journeyed people through or guided people through the site. And that was in two ways. You could either do the experience as a single person on your own, because we found through the research that a lot of people would go to St Fagans to walk their dog, go to St Fagans just to have a walk, or go to St Fagans just to have a cup of coffee and to just sit in the space. So it wasn't necessarily seen as a place that was purely for education, in terms of I'm going to go to this museum, I'm going to go here to actually just have some downtime and spend some time for my own well-being. So we discovered that through the research. So we created a version that you could do on your own, and that led along an accessible route, so a wheelchair accessible route through the space, and took about half an hour. But then we also had a version which was for two people, and again this was through the research that a lot of couples would go there, or people would go with friends. So we made a version where you could do in pairs, and that took about 40 minutes. So you had this audio experience essentially that used composition to tell a story and journey you through. So a kind of unknown narrator almost, this untold guide that held your hand as you moved through the space. And then that guide would encourage you to have moments where you would stop and look, have moments where you could stop and, touch and feel the surface beneath your hands. There's a moment, I think, where we ask people to place their hands on a wall and feel that connection of touch between their hands and the fibre of the wall itself.
I think we actually asked them to leave a memory there,
yes,
which is, super enticing, and what an invitation.
Press your back against the wall, facing your partner. Place both palms flat on the surface of the wall either side of you. Close your eyes. See the happiest moment of your life. Conjure the shape of it. Feel the joy of it. Running as fast as you can when you were 6. Being kissed for the very first time. Falling in love. Allow it to fill your being. Would you leave this memory here for us, my friend? Would you leave it like the imprint of your hand within the stone, and make this place a part of you, and you a part of it, as Rose did, as Agnes has?
Sometimes if you were doing the pair experience, you would be separated by the different audio tracks that each partner would have. So you'd kind of move away from each other, but then always come back to each other. So you'd move away, come back, going on different paths. And one part of the narration might ask you to look over across the garden to the gilded gate, and there you would see standing a figure holding the gate in their hands. And then that person's audio would ask them to stand in front of the gate and hold the bars of the gate and look through. So your partner became almost the actor in your experience.
So super cool.
Yeah. And I think that, again, that sort of embodiment of the experience, not only for the watcher, but also for the listener, and how those roles changed and intersected. And we tried to be really playful with it. I think there was a moment where we asked people to come together again. When you got separated, you'd meet your partner through the tunnel of this kind of amazing kind of vine tunnel with all these plants around it, and you got to play paper, scissors, stone. And just having those moments within that space, I think, were really fun. And we had described the piece, or somebody had described the piece, and we used it, I think, then within the marketing as a mix between a meditation and a game and storytelling, which I think does actually sum the experience up really, really quite nicely, because there are moments where we allow you to stop, take a pause, take everything in with all of the senses available to you. And there are moments of story that float between, I guess, fact and fiction. Part of the work that we did, we looked through the archives within St Fagans that were attached to St Fagans, and kind of had gone through the same process that we did with New Eyes I See. What does the space tell us in terms of its history, as we've spoken about? And then also, what does the space give us in terms of how it can elicit certain feelings and moods. And depending on, and you touched upon this, depending on when you went during the year, because you're within a living space, a living environment, it could look so different in the summer where everything is in bloom, everything is green, to then if you go and do the experience then in the winter where everything is very different and it gives you a different sense. So it's very organic in its being there, you know. So that in itself, which I don't think we appreciated when we were creating it, because I think we started working on the project, it must have been maybe within autumn winter, and then when we released the project in summer we realized this seasonal shift, which again gives people a very different feel to the story. And on this project, we worked with writer Sarah Lewis, a bilingual writer, who worked with us really, really closely on the narratives, looking at what is within the archives and then what stories we can sort of have fictional license with or artistic license with, and moments where we can maybe expand the story somewhat and take it away a little bit from some of the archives. And she is a beautiful writer, really, really lyrical. And when we came to look at the Welsh language version of Traces, so the Welsh language companion, Olion, I always remember her saying, you know, Welsh sings in a very different way to the English language. It has this musicality and lyricism, which is so different in terms of rhythm and pace and beat. And she treated that interpretation of the Welsh companion as a story in its own right.
Yeah, separate kind of work strand, wasn't it?
Absolutely. So it wasn't a direct translation. It was a piece in its own right that had the essence of the stories within the English, but sat as a Welsh language piece.
Dyma'i hoff le eistedd. Wrth dy ymyl, mae adlais o ddyn sy'n eistedd gyda'i gi, Bobby. Milgi bach arian las wedi ei beintio gan yr hwyrnos a'i drochi mewn serlwch. Fe ddaw e yma I ddianc rhag yr holl mae'n ei wybod, I ddarbwyllo'i hunan bod hyd a lledrith mewn byd o sylwedd gwyddonol a reswm. Mae'n trio ailgysylltu, I wneud synwyr mewn byd sydd yn llawn strwythyr gronynog o ofod am ymrynau. Mae'n hiraethu amser pan nad oedd ei ben mor llawn, pan a fyddai'n gwrando'n ddiniwed ar bwsau ei dad. Mi fyddai dal I wrando am amser hir ar ôl iddo wybod yr atebion, yn cogio bod yn syn bob tro. Honno oedd ei hoff ddawns.
And then alongside the words of the piece, composition played a huge part in the storytelling and language. So we worked with a composer called Jack Poor, who we work with a lot. He's a brilliant composer, and he kind of took the essence of the words and used and crafted the composition in a way that allowed us to tell the story. So in places where between locations where we ask people to move, we might want people to have a fairly kind of quick pace. So the music would have this certain rhythm which dictated a pace. Moments where we wanted people to linger, the music changed, and it was a complement then, or almost an actor in the piece, to Natalie Paisley, who was our actor, to that anonymous voice. So these two things very much inhabiting that space and telling the story together as a single entity almost. And what you said in terms of the technology, I think we are generally interested, and we've had lots of conversations about this, and we were interested in this piece about the technology enriching the experience, but not being the experience, not being front and centre, very much playing a part that it facilitates that for you. And even though the app was delivered on a mobile phone, we encouraged you to put that phone in your pocket, so it became an invisible companion to your experience as you moved through the sequence. So rather than looking at your screen, you were looking at the environment and the space around you, which was absolutely part of it. And I guess we were trying to make things feel quite filmic and frame certain parts of the garden or certain parts of the space. And so that framing of that space to, again, elicit that feeling and sense of place, as well as sense of place within the story that you were listening to, was really, really key part of what we were trying to do.
And as you were talking then, I was just thinking that one of the things we learned, I think, with New Eyes I See, that we took into Traces and maybe embraced a little bit more. I think with New Eyes I See, we were very worried about this kind of line between fact and fiction. We didn't want to kind of push too far at the narrative or to, begin to suggest other kinds of connections. We wanted to keep it very kind of, factual to these kind of fragments that we'd found. And I think in discussions then with the museum afterwards, I think they were quite intrigued that we had done that, because they maybe had hoped that we would push a little bit more actually at something that was a bit, a little bit more kind of lyrical or, mythical or, whatever it might be. And so I think we kind of took that permission with Traces and, embraced that a little bit more, worried less about kind of, sticking to those facts and not that we kind of, made lots of things up. It was kind of grounded in fact, but to have a little bit more kind of, playfulness, as you said, kind of, in the mix there, and to, suggest things in a way that we maybe didn't with New Eyes I See.
Going off of what you've just said about the less factual nature of it, and maybe discussing an element of it which was kind of about feeling and trying to elicit feeling, and that's definitely a projection on our part in terms of what we thought people might be feeling from the archival material, but that was still a kind of interesting new version. I guess you kind of mentioned it by the touch and the connection and things like that, and the mulberry tree. But then I think it's a point that we grew into that desire to try and make work that was specifically designed to emote a feeling and almost ignore story, or use story as a mechanic to get there, but not necessarily. It could literally just be, like you say, the happiness could be brought by you leaving that leaf, and seeing someone else's leaf there, or connection.
In digital heritage work, I think that's a really important observation, because museums are doing interpretation all over the place. Like, what they don't need is another bit of the same interpretation. The stories they're already telling, they may be telling perfectly well. People might be responding to that, in the ways that they are hoping they might. So they want us to do something a bit different. And I think we understood that more after with New Eyes I See. And actually, I was reminding myself in one of the papers that we presented, we said the words, "It does not provide more information, it provides more feels." And it tickled me when I read that back, because now people talk about the feels all
I love
the time.
the hyper-aggressive start of that, though. It does not provide more information.
No, and it was like there were lots of short sentences, lots of full stops. We were felt we needed to be very clear about what it was we were trying to do. More feels.
More feels, absolutely more feels. Because you're right, the museum already provides that. And I suppose coming in as a team, we wanted to challenge those things, didn't we? In terms of, is there a different way we can tell stories within this space? And what does that actually look like and feel like for audiences, and does that then potentially draw new audiences into that space because the interaction or the conversation is different, and it might then provide maybe slightly different perspectives on those spaces as cultural institutions,
and kind of that layering of something else kind of on top. And I was reminded as you were speaking then that at the time we were talking about this as the term we used was a subtle mob.
Oh, yeah.
So doing something that was quite kind of, subtle in the space. So there was lots of talk about flash mobs at the time, which were these big kind of noisy performative things that would happen in, train stations and all over the place. And you had come across this term subtle mob,
Yes.
which I just loved.
Borrowed by Duncan Speakman from a company called Circumstance in Bristol.
Well remembered.
Yeah, inspired by his work and how they talk about these types of engagements in public space.
Yeah. And almost like imperceptible, kind of interactions that are happening and being layered into a place. So nobody knows that this like quite profound often thing is happening for you. You're just somebody who's walking around with your headphones on. Yeah.
Which I guess is part of the brief that the museum sort of gave us, really. It had to be something that was low maintenance for the staff to not really have to necessarily worry about. All they had to do was obviously let people know that there was something that they could do in that part of the grounds. So, and then also not be disruptive to generally the general running of that space.
Yeah.
So not having lots of things in space that had to, I don't know, be moved every now and again, or, whatever.
The bench. Tell us about the bench.
The bench. So what we had done with the design of the peaks was often ask people either to stand in a certain place or sit in a certain place. So there were some really lovely benches, always three white benches, just by some little oriental gardens just in front of the house. And those, every time we'd been, and this was over months of recce's, those three benches had always been there. And often when we were there, when me and Sarah would go and visit and try and track a route through the space, we'd sit on this bench and we would be like, this is a really nice place to have one of the locations. So let's get people to sit on this bench before then they turn the corner to meet their partner and do the
rock, paper, scissors. Yeah.
Rock, paper, scissors game. So that bench had always been there. And then what we discovered as months went on, things get moved in these spaces. And that bench, that white bench, got moved often. So because that white bench wasn't there, people would think it would be the next white bench along. So they'd sit on that white bench. So the next direction, which would be walk forward and turn right, would take them in a completely different direction.
Nightmare.
So what we've learned from that experience is things in physical spaces change and shift, particularly benches. So we're not going to do that again. When we would visit, if that bench had moved, we'd move it away from where it'd be moved to put it back in the original position. I've done that at least 4 times. I mean, the groundskeepers were like, why does this bench keep moving? We always tried to do it at the end of the day, so it was almost as if the bench had, walked itself back to its location. So yeah, that was hilarious because it did knock people off their journeys.
Bane of our life. That
it
bench
was the bane of that
while.
bench.
But you mentioned the groundskeepers there, and actually they were super important in the story of Traces because was it you? Was it Sarah who chatted with the gardeners, and they were full of stories, and those stories were not getting told. So we were able to kind of capture that and integrate some of those stories into the narrative.
Yeah, they were absolutely amazing. The people that we spoke to who worked day to day in those spaces were incredible. Yeah, and the knowledge that they had about that space and the passion that they had about that space as well, I think really, really influenced the direction of some of the ways that we wanted people to interact with that space. Absolutely. Yeah, the kind of almost reverence of that space was just so warming every time we spoke to them. So we wanted to bring that into the experience for other people to feel that sense of joy actually within, moments of darkness within the narrative as well, so that light and joy, that darkness and light very much being part of the experience. And yeah, without their input, it wouldn't necessarily be the piece that it became. And being able to have the opportunity to integrate that into the narrative was brilliant.
have been called collector and guide, the unraveller of thread. Surrender yourself to this journey, to the order and disorder, the clarity and confusion, the artistry and chaos. See yourself reflected in the tales you hear, in the people you will meet, Agnes and Rose and the others. They will sometimes walk with you, but you will not see them. You will not need to see them. But will their stories help you to remember, to release, to receive, to resolve? These are the stories that make the trees grow. They nourish the soil. There is a reason that you are here today. You are at the centre of this journey, and at the centre you will be. You alone will hear what you hear and feel what you feel. Is your sorrow like any other? This moment has passed, and you must move on to the next. We must enter the labyrinth together. Are you ready for what you will find?
I guess the interesting bit from our perspective, again, was an element of basically deciding on whether the stuff we're making is good or crap, right? And I think the research or the ability to then get people either interviewed or to mind map where they've been and to do that kind of collection of their experience kind of informed your work anyway for the next 10 years in a sense, right? In the sense that it was the idea of needing to go beyond just like, yeah, it was great, 3 stars, you know? Because I guess that's kind of a traditional theatre background, that's all you need. But the point was, I guess, was it more effective, or was it as, not effective seems like a definitive kind of thing, but did it have any impact beyond just a normal museum, experience or a normal walk around St. Fagans? And I think the research you guys did seemed at least to be, a big part of the project, and its superpower really, in a sense.
We got so much rich data, as I like to call it, insight from people, coming out of that project. So we spent, I think, 2 or 3 days on site. We had some PhD students who we paid to come and join us. We had lots of conversations with people kind of before they went and did the experience. Some did the single experience, some did the partner experience. There was obviously the Welsh language one as well, so some people did that. And that was in the single and the partner experience as well. So there were kind of 4 experiences. And then, so they would go off and they would do the experience, and then they would come back. We would have conversations with them, but that would start with a kind of a couple of activities. So we asked them, I think, now, am I going to mess up the order of this? So we asked them to write down, I think, 3 words that kind of summed up the experience for them on a piece of paper. And then we asked them to map their experience. And we left that kind of instruction quite kind of open, so they could kind of, interpret that however they liked. And some people would map it quite literally in terms of the space, and how they'd navigated that, where they'd been, and, drawing little kind of, elements of the experience, the bridges, the buildings and whatnot. And then other people would map the kind of emotional landscape of the experience, which was really lovely to, to see, and again unprompted, so those maps were that was really great to see how people embraced doing that. They were really lovely. And then we would have a conversation with people where we would ask them to talk us through their map, talk us through the words that they'd chosen, and then we would ask them maybe some more kind of specific questions, and or we would give them some more specific prompts to talk about the experience in terms of space, immersion, how they were feeling, and all the rest of it. So we had some really rich data come through there. And we wrote a couple of papers, I think, using that data, which I would encourage people to read, because the data it's lovely. The way people talked about the project and the incredible range of different meanings that had for them. And I guess that's, as you say, when you've got your 3 stars and a one word review, it's quite remote. You don't get access to all of that unexpected and unanticipated stuff that's going on for people, and the connections that they start to make. And people talked about their family connections, and the fact that they were getting married in a week's time, and they'd found this incredibly romantic, doing this together, or people who were doing it with their friends, or who were grieving for loved ones, or the connections were incredible. So people, they talked a lot about emotions. They talked a lot about the kind of sociality of the experience, especially with that kind of partner journey. I think we'd managed to achieve something that was very much kind of not tech-centric. So people, apart from where the kind of, if there was a moment where the tech had kind of, they'd got out of alignment or something like that, and things hadn't quite matched up maybe with the narratives as people had kind of, joined back together. People didn't really notice the technology, and that was really nice. So to kind of, not to have that front and center in the experience. And of course, the storytelling, people, really enjoyed the storytelling, and we had this wonderful narration and this beautiful musical composition in the background. But again, one of the things that came through for me quite strongly was this sense of, hybridity. So, this thing existing kind of between the digital and the physical. And people have very strong, I think anyway, kind of emotional attachments to the space and place of St Fagans, because they went there with school, or they've been there with their grandkids, or whatever it might be. To kind of, to encourage them to have a different kind of experience within that space that happened to be facilitated digitally was great. And there were a few moments where that hybridity, I think, was really, impressive, and people would talk about it. There's a moment, so St Fagans, the house there, had, again, another kind of World War I connection. It had been used as a hospital for returning soldiers. And there's a moment in the narrative where one of the, in the partner experience, one of you, but in the single experience, you as the person who's experiencing it, sits on a bench and looks out over this area of the gardens that has these mulberry trees in it. And these are really kind of, especially in the winter when there's no leaves on these trees, they're gnarly and awkward, and they look like they're bursting out of the ground. And it looked like a scene of kind of devastation, and people would sit on the bench and they would be told about Mamet's Wood and these soldiers whose lives were, devastated in the war, and who then came back to St Fagans to try and kind of, rebuild their lives. And it was so evocative, that space, those trees. And so, that was such a clever piece of the narrative. I can say that because I didn't write the narrative. It was so clever. And that moment where we asked people to put their hands on the stone and leave a memory, it's so tactile. Again, quite a kind of, it's digital, but it's physical. And there was another bit of the narrative where we asked people to leave a leaf or something, to take a leaf from a tree and to leave it for somebody else. And so if somebody else had done the experience that day, it would just be a little kind of simple marker to tell you, to connect you with somebody who was, no longer in that space. So just really nice, clever moments like that people, really appreciated and reflected on, fulsomely. And I think there was very much a sense that people felt that their relationship with that place was kind of altered by doing traces. And I cannot be at St Fagans without thinking about traces, and without wanting to put my hands back on that piece of stone and to connect with that, and that's so rich. For a digital heritage project or for a museum, what powerful kind of connections we were building there for people.